Hey, hello everyone. It's Warrington Ellacott of the Canadian Association of Importers and Exports. Very glad to be back. My apologies. I've been a little under the weather, so we've had to defer the podcast for a little bit. My very special guest today is Dr. David Johnston. David is the director of the George Weston Center for Sustainable Supply Chains, and he's also a director of the Master of Supply Chain Management program at the Schulich School of Business here in Toronto at York University. David, welcome to the pod.
It's a pleasure to be here, Warrington.
Yeah, so just a brief update for our friends in the South. Canada has been very active in getting some multilateral trade agreements together. There was just recent visits by the Prime Minister to India, Japan, and Australia, and those were very successful. And also, there's a by-election upcoming in 3 important ridings in Canada. And if the Liberals of Prime Minister Carney are able to win those 3 ridings, they would achieve a majority in the House of Commons. So that would be a very interesting change in things. So that gets you up to speed. Our conversation today with David is around some of the geopolitical impacts on supply chains, but just supply chains in general. And so I think, David, the way to start off the conversation is, why don't you just inform the listeners about what's happening at York University and some of the things that you folks are doing at the Schulich School of Business.
Well, let me start off with the George Weston Center for Sustainable Supply Chains, which is a center of excellence at the Schulich School of Business at York University. So the original premise of this center was, when it was started, which was in 2019, when it was actually announced, was that we were going to deal with how do we make supply chains last for the long term. That's the definition of sustainability. And of course, we're talking a lot about things such as climate change. We're talking about social responsibility, those kind of things. But the other part of it is also how to keep them profitable, and also contributing to larger societal goals such as growth, and a better standard of living and better wellness for the citizens that these supply chains provide. And of course, then the pandemic happens in 2020. And we all suddenly learn about what happens when you disrupt the supply chain. And so that became a very important focus of what we were doing with the center and our mission when it came to educating future supply chain professionals, the people that manage all those planes, boats, and trains, airplanes that allow you to import and export product around the world. So the last 5 or 6 years, we've been spending a fair bit of time about obviously dealing with some of the traditional things people associate with sustainability, but also how do we make resilient and robust supply chains? And there's been a lot of ink spilled in academia, as well as out in the managerial press, about various ideas about how we should do this. And of course, suddenly, with basically around the election of Donald Trump as the president of the United States, we enter a new era of disruption around geopolitical risk factors. And one thing that I would probably point your listeners to, there is a article that we published in 2022 in the Sloan Management Review on getting prepared for the next disruption. So this was before our current last 2 years of activity. And basically the things that we suggest about systematically preparing to be disrupted and having your plan B in order, maybe this would be something useful as a framework for them.
Yeah, certainly a timely conversation. Okay, very good. Well, then let's start. You previously had put some op-eds out, and you talked about public infrastructure projects and how listeners should view those infrastructure projects. Obviously, they're very important, like the expansion at Port of Montreal, Contrecoeur, very important to the Canadian supply chains. But how should the viewers view these announcements and big infrastructure projects in terms of their own supply chain challenges and opportunities?
Well, I think I was reacting to some of the announcements from our federal government, and that was the administration of Prime Minister Carney, of course, that we're entering a new era of nation building. So there's some very large capital works projects, expansions of ports like the Port of Montreal and the Port of Vancouver, looking at a new port up in our Arctic to open as the global warming creates the Northwest Passage as an option, looking at changing our transportation infrastructure to move product and people more east-west than just getting across the border between the
No
United
doubt.
States and
Yeah.
Canada. So I'm very much responding to that. And just for your viewers, of course, our federal government has announced a large investment, 15 billion plus, to get a lot of these projects going. And as I said, there are infrastructure projects. There's also a few things involved with enabling greater productivity across Canada. But one thing that I would caution, particularly those folks who are active importers and exporters, where you're dealing with the here and now, right?
Yeah.
And suddenly you're finding there's a tariff there. Sometimes you're discovering that it's a little slower at that crossing point, and that's appearing overnight. These infrastructure projects that will hopefully add capacity for emerging trade routes that are a result of these agreements will come on stream, but they will take years to do.
Yeah, sure.
And
Yeah.
that's the time horizon you have to deal with. So in the short term, thinking a little bit about how you can be more agile within the existing infrastructure and its capacity constraints.
No doubt. And you'd also talked recently about, locking in these transport capacity options and making sure, like, resilience is a topic we've discussed it many times before, especially with the current events here going on in the Middle East, even more disruption and more change. So how should listeners be thinking about those kind of backup options in their supply chains to help them move those goods?
Yes. And of course, your flexibility and your clout to be able to act upon having other options is a function of the size of your company in some cases and your relationship with your suppliers and your distributors, either forward or back with your supply chain. Obviously, if you're a more significant part of the business of your transportation carrier or your supplier who maybe handles that for you or your distributor, you have more negotiating room to ask for having some other options. And they're more motivated, obviously.
Sure.
Also realize, though, at the same time, you might be a bit uneasy and directly hurting. They are also hurting. And so there should be some mutual motivation here to think about, is there ways that we can make ourselves more flexible to deal in the short term, these shocks that are being introduced seemingly sometimes overnight?
And
And I would say that's one of the interesting parts that has nothing to do with trade studies and that sort of thing. It has to do with mental attitude when you
right.
go into negotiations between supplier and buyers, is that basically some don't recognize that you have a mutual problem. And by dialogue, you work through it and find ways of dealing with them. Do you want it to be the norm going forward, that everything is a daily chaotic exercise? No. And that's why sometimes, as I think we'll get into, you start having to have your own longer term plan about how are you going to position your organization and your partners to deal with a situation where, eventually there will be infrastructure capacity. There will
Right.
be maybe a need to pivot away from certain markets that are just too unstable.
Right. And in certain cases, the listeners, obviously larger firms, may be thinking about co-investment, either with other private sector firms or maybe even with government. So what's your view in that space?
Once again, that's the size of the organization makes a difference. But if I'm a smaller organization, I'm looking at banding together with others. So industrial associations like the one that
True.
you belong to, Warrington, I strongly recommend that. There's safety in numbers, and you get listened to when you go to the government, and you get listened to. I don't know whether some of your existing listers and the members of your association also are in buying groups and things like that. Those things all amplify your voice. For
Sure.
larger organizations, of course, governments, to get these infrastructure projects going, are going to have to partner with industry. They're going to need people to do the construction. They're
Sure.
going to know that there's customers in advance that are going to actually run volume through that expansion, say, of the Port of Montreal or that northern port. That gives them greater certainty in their planning. That also announces that there's stakeholders that they should consult with, maybe have input into what is needed in the design of that facility, not only in the capacity it needs to have, but also just how to accommodate your flow of products. So, how much is the product going to be carried in cargo containers versus loose product? And that's
Sure.
all that stuff is where you can have a collaboration, providing you can amplify your voice sufficiently. And of course, that voice is going to be something that you're going to share with increasingly government in Canada, who are going to be, wanting to push these projects, as is the new kind of attitude of our federal government.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we certainly do at the association, that's for sure. So shifting gears towards USMCA or CUSMA or whatever the definition is, obviously this is a topic of conversation, and Minister LeBlanc was recently in Washington for talks with the USTR's Jameson Greer. I now see the Mexicans are officially kicking off discussions with USTR, I believe, on the 16th. And there was also commitments from Canada and Mexico to also have more robust conversations in May. So we're all coming together towards the July timeline. What that outcome is, I don't think anybody really knows, but I think it's important for listeners to be managing their U.S. exposure and their near-term commercial risks. I don't think we're telling anybody any new news here, but if you could offer some prudent advice in that space, I think everyone would appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think, we're not going to pivot overnight and start selling a lot more to Europe or to Asia. And as much as I would applaud the Prime Minister for opening these channels up for us, and the other thing actually I would add to this, by the way, that next, before we get into the U.S. channel, is of course in Canada, where for your U.S. listeners, there's been a lot more talk about interprovincial trade, so more domestic flow, and how we enabled industry up here just selling to other Canadians. And that's, of course, something that can be explored. So, but the reality is we up in Canada are dependent on our relationships with the United States. And not only in the short term, but in the long term. This is a very historically been a very prosperous trading relationship, and that's recognized on both sides of the border, even though it might not be supported necessarily in the current administration. And I think that will come around, is my guess. Right. How quickly, once again, we're getting into political prediction. So you don't want to burn any bridges, but you might want to have a frank conversation about the impact of when these tariffs come on and off, and what happens at some of these pinch points crossing the border. You've had previous, I believe, podcasts, I believe, Warrington, when you're talking about there's some volatility about how things are moving in and out of the United States. But I think the important thing is your conversation. When these things strike, the first instinct should always be, let's go talk to our trade partner. The business-to-business people, and instead of trying to go in it alone and try to figure out, well, how can I insulate the financial shock, or maybe open up a new market, just once again evaluate what is the actual material impact of this in the short term. And what happens, of course, how long, I think most of the calculations that people make whenever there's a pronouncement that affects the trade pattern is, of course, what is the cash flow implications of it? Whether your inventory position, your shipping costs, your volumes, however it's manifesting. But always don't lose your head, do the math, and have the conversation.
Yeah, and I think lastly, we've been talking a lot on the pod about diversification and expansion into global markets, and I've always encouraged the listeners to utilize, some of the Indo-Pacific strategies that have, at least on the Canadian side, and I know the United States and Mexico have got some very wonderful programs for importers and exporters alike to engage with new foreign markets. And when we think about these foreign markets, it is a different way of doing business, but there's also the modes to get those goods to and from those new markets differs from what people may be used to. So if we think about the airspace, for example, air is something that the listeners should be paying attention to, correct?
Yes, you look at all different modes of transport. When we had problems, for instance, in Canada here and in the United States with, taking containers off ships, putting them on rail cars, we put them on trucks. And when we couldn't get them on trucks, we broke the containers out and put them loosely into trucks. And with the idea of, sure, our costs are going to go up, but what we don't want is empty shelves. And hopefully that's not the normal going forward. But that's exactly what we do. You have to always consider is that your mode is going to shift around. Air travel or air transport is not a cheap way to do things. If you can put it on a ship, it's great. And by the way, as somebody who runs a sustainable supply chain center, of course, we want to encourage people to use both methods. Obviously,
Yes, of course.
it's the lowest carbon alternative. Right now, I would say your listeners are not so much worried about the environmental sustainability issue as just basically trying to keep the business afloat.
Yeah, true.
So thinking a little bit about that. Bearing in mind, of course, when you change modes and that sort of thing, is your ability to negotiate price and terms of shipment. Prioritization for that mode of transportation varies with, what kind of commitment over the long term you can make to it. And that affects. So if you jump around a lot, you might not be necessarily getting the best deal either. So if you can partner, and once again, this might be a size of your organization issue, is if you can partner with certain carriers for the longer period of time and really establish a good working relationship with them, that it keeps your costs down usually, but it also cuts you some slack when you need to pivot very quickly. I need to have a shipment sent a little bit in a greater volume than I originally planned with you, or you need to back off a little bit because the conditions have changed overnight.
And I'll stand up for my Newfoundland colleagues. They also would like to see some increased ferry capacity as well. So we can't forget the ferries in this conversation. All right. Well, so wrapping up then, I think, what would you say is the top two considerations for the listeners here as we progress through the current state of unease? What were the top two things on your mind that they should be thinking about for the next, 120 to 180 days?
Yeah, just think of, I think I've been pretty consistent over the last little piece that that you should always consider your critical business partners and make sure that you're communicating with them about what they're seeing, and what you're experiencing, and you're having some frank discussions. Obviously, communication is always the best way to deal with any disruption or any crisis. Is the first thing is your channels of communication. The second thing that I would also advocate, which sometimes we don't do because we want to manage on the seat of our pants some days, is that you do sit down and think about, well, if this is the new reality, as our prime minister has used in various speeches, that, we're going to see a shift in the trade pattern, which could expose us to other risks, then maybe we should be thinking a little bit about how do we gradually, move the super tanker of our business to start pointing in a different direction, to think a little bit longer than the next month or two or 3 months or so. I would also suggest not losing sight of opportunities.
Oh, good.
In a crisis, there's opportunities. So one of the things that suddenly has appeared on the agenda here up in Canada is we have these infrastructure projects, and we also have a commitment to increase our defense spending. So suddenly we also are going to be spending a lot more money on defense. And of course, we want to spend it on the regional producers of defense material. And there's opportunities to be involved in those industries. There's also, from an import-export point of view, is you don't build a defense capability or an infrastructure capability just within your own country. Often you have to have other partners in other parts of the world who have the technology and material.
Sure.
And, there needs to be a strategy with regards to imports and exports when we start making investments domestically in something like defense or these infrastructure projects. Getting involved in that flow of goods and services, I think, is an interesting thing to explore as a business opportunity for some segments of the import-export driven side of our economy.
Sure, reasonable and good. And I think we should also think about our Mexican colleagues as well and make sure that we have strong lanes between Mexico and Canada moving forward in the event that, something untoward happens within USMCA. We still have CPTPP, and we can trade effectively with our Mexican colleagues. Well, that's wonderful. Well, Dr. David Johnston, it's been a real pleasure. We're going to put David's contacts in the pod here, but obviously good advice for everyone. And our thanks to the guys at the Global Training Center for hosting us today. And with that, I'll bid you all a good day, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.
Thanks for Warrington. Bye, everyone. Thank you.